product, insofar as I can see, is a way to determine who gets what. No doubt the distribution of money in the current system is unfair to many people on the basis of prime survival, but money is only a means to decide allocation of what is available. If there is no money, how does society decide who gets what if the demand is larger than the supply? Okay, I can tell right off the bat that you're either knowingly or maybe unknowingly coming at this from the standpoint of the Austrian economics angle, which by the way is also known as the economic calculation problem. First off, I would state that we don't need price to allocate resources, because even currently we have in part a non-monetary element to resource allocation that's been used for decades and could, if unhindered, do a far greater job at resource allocation. It's called inventory management. The only reason why price is used as well in parallel with it is because we live in a monetary system and companies need to make money. It's like, say for example, yourself and a real dick of a friend of yours gets invited to a party, and this dick of a friend of yours is only invited because he drives, right? And you don't. Simple. I mean, it's probably a bad analogy, but you get my point. The task of allocating resources can be done just as well, if not better, without needing the price mechanism, because the inventory side takes into consideration what is moving, what isn't, what rate of demand is there, thus what rate of supply is required. It's a technical consideration, not a monetary one. And for the life of me, I can't understand that with current technologies and technical understandings, this fallacy of a calculation problem is still purported. But tell you what, if you want to find out more, Neil Kiernan, the host of V Radio, has hosted 2 shows on this topic that I can remember. There may be more, but there's the interview that he did with Stéphane Molyneux, which actually wasn't initially about this contention, but it did become about it. And there's also another show he did called A Realistic Look at the Economic Calculation Problem. I urge you all to check those out. I mean, Neil does some fantastic shows. I mean, I tell you, I'd recommend all of his shows, actually. He's really, really cool. But also, for those of you not yet convinced about this and don't want to sift through hours and hours of radio shows, there's a very, very, very astute observation that I've come across recently by one of our advocates. He goes by the name of, and I apologize in advance for my bad pronunciation, Jasgarcha. Sorry if I pronounced it wrong. He's also, interestingly, a biology researcher. What I'm going to do here is read a bit from a book that he wrote entitled The First Civilization. Quote, "The first problem goes something like this. An economic system without price would not work because there would be no way to set a value for goods and services. How then could we possibly figure out a rational way to allocate them? This conundrum is called the economic calculation problem, and at first glance this logic actually seems quite sound. However, this assertion makes the daring assumption that the market actually allocates resources in a rational way, an assumption that is difficult to defend when one looks at the world that this method of distribution has created, where 2 identical articles of clothing can have wildly different prices just because one has a brand name label on it, and a small portion of the population controls a huge percentage of the planet's resources. Whether such a method of distributing resources is rational is seriously questionable. But I won't linger on this question any longer for a very important reason. The ability to assign prices to goods and services loses any and all meaning in a post-scarcity economy. We can think of it in terms of the law of supply and demand. This economic rule dictates that as the supply of a good or service increases, the price for it must drop. Likewise, as demand for something increases, the price for it drops as well. Therefore, if we could reach a point where the supply of something was vastly higher than the demand, the price would become so low that it would become indistinguishable from zero. This could be done in two ways. We could either reach a point where we are able to provide a much greater supply of goods and services than what is needed, or we could reduce the demand for them dramatically. In an RBE, both of these moves would be taken. By creating an environment that no longer precludes individuals to a materialistic addiction, there would be a massive drop in demand for essentially every kind of commodity. By taking advantage of automation and largely removing the need for human labor, the supply of goods and services would be able to vastly surpass the demand. What is the point in charging money for shelter or food when there is more than enough of either to satisfy the demand of every individual in that society? Why charge money for access to goods when they are so abundantly available for access? If the price of everything in a society was essentially zero, there would no longer be any logical way to distribute goods and services based on the price mechanism. Without the ability to assign a value to anything, there would no longer be any reason to maintain a currency of any kind. This is why price would not be used in an RBE. It would simply serve no rational purpose. But if we cannot make use of the price mechanism, then how do we figure out a way to allocate resources? The traditional alternative to a market-based system is a centrally planned system, one in which a group of people decide how the economy will be run for their entire population. However, this kind of system has been criticized because of issues relating to information. How do planners receive the necessary information to make informed decisions? How can something as complicated as an economy be comprehensively planned by one group? Won't there always be an informational disconnect that exists between the population and the planners? It becomes quickly apparent that a centrally planned economy is not a very plausible alternative to the market system. However, we overcome the limitations of central planning in an RBE by making use of the survey system, in which planning is not centralized. It is actually dispersed throughout the entire population. By having economic decisions made at the level of each individual, we gradually reduce the complexity that the planners, the members of the population, have to deal with. Each person has access to the information necessary to make their own economic decisions, the person's own consumption habits. This information is then sent to and processed by the global databases, which are themselves distributed networks. Since the population has already done much of the work of planning, the databases are responsible simply for the execution of the plan, a purely algorithmic task based on rules of priority, as we discussed in the previous section, which is precisely what computers excel at. A system in which the population is in direct control of their economic lives has been called a participatory economy, or PARICON for short. This kind of system offers an alternative to the market system while overcoming the informational disconnect that plagues a centrally planned system. Logically speaking, it is only because of the invention of the Internet that this kind of system is even possible, an invention which would have been difficult for the economists of the early 20th century to predict. What we ultimately need to keep in mind is that the basis of every school of traditional economic thinking is scarcity, the idea that there is not enough for everyone, and the dramatic effects this reality has on human behavior. This concept is the foundation on which all of the economic systems of past and present are built. Scarcity is as fundamental to traditional economic thinking as the value of pi is to geometry. Traditional economic thinking therefore has little or no validity in analyzing a post-scarcity economy. It would be like trying to do geometry in a world where the value of pi is banana suitcase. Even the most basic of assumptions no longer holds true. End quote. Now, in a very long-winded fashion, I believe that answers the question. So, moving on. Question 3. How are you going to make reasonable projections about what is possible with available resources, even imagining that your census of existing resources can be properly carried out? I dare say that the answer I gave for the previous question answers most of this. Thing is, while preparing for this podcast, I read this question over and over to myself, and I'm not sure where your logic is coming from. Because as far as I can tell, given the proper execution of this survey system, then the reasonable projections, as you've called them, is the logical outcome of that. Is it any stretch of the imagination that when you submit exactly what you would need, along with a degree of contingency, that this data would be collated and calculated properly by the cybernated system? Maybe you're asking this in terms of how I'm going to make these projections, that being how a human being is going to make these projections, when in fact that isn't going to be the case. Is it efficient or even optimal to charge human beings with the task of calculating the optimal allocation of resources dictated by their submitted survey of resource requirements? No. This process will be dealt with by machines. And just before any of you feel the need to recoil in horror at that concept, relax. Because that process of machines arriving at decisions of allocation for you are already done for you today on multiple levels. Examples of this would include, your thermostat, your air conditioning, your water meter, the search engines you use, the automated robots in pharmacies, your sat-nav. Need I go on? You still do have that input to give feedback and guidance to that allocation, but it is managed by machines. The difference between all of those different processes that exist today and an RBEM is that you will have even more freedom to interact with the processes which manage the allocation of resources. If you don't like the way it works, by all means, show how it can be improved, and improvements will be made. Everyone wins. Anyway, question 4. You have mentioned before about the apparent lack of imagination when it comes to movies portraying human beings behaving altruistically together and in equilibrium with nature. I have lost count of the films that use global catastrophe or widespread destruction as a main theme. Is our seeming fascination with violence being propagated by the media? Are filmmakers discouraged from producing films which depict working RBE realities because of potential sales flops, complete lack of understanding, and pressure from the dominant powers above, which influence against any kind of anti-capitalist notions of the future? Why do we as a species use our best form of communication to fantasize about mass murder rather than suggesting possible solutions to the problems we all face? Care to shed some light on the matter? Well, first off, I would completely agree. And to a degree, you've actually answered your own question. And considering the amount of time that has passed since I first answered a question on this very topic, I still haven't come across a film that portrays a positive view of the future for humanity on Earth. Not one. And just so you know, folks, that challenge to find such a film is still on. Okay? So please let me know if there is one. But recently I've been pondering